Good morning. This is Anthony Parent of IRS Medic, and today we're going to ask this question: should Americans overseas have the right to vote? Should they be allowed to vote? And if you are overseas, should you vote? This might be a startling, it might be a difficult, controversial topic, but what we've seen is that Americans overseas have been used for votes, but they haven't been getting a lot. Now, since 1976, Americans overseas have had the right to vote in federal elections. This was a federal law that was passed. But the question we need to ask is, what has it accomplished? Has it accomplished anything good? Right now FBAR penalties are targeting retirees abroad with horrific penalties, something no one would ever vote for. Foreign pensions are difficult, if not impossible to have, and taxed onerously. FATCA, the Foreign Account Tax Compliance Act, has been the biggest middle finger possible to Americans abroad, making their life impossible and forcing many to renounce. We get to the transition tax. That's 2017. That was just a pure theft, a confiscation, and that case is currently in Supreme Court. We're waiting for that to be decided. And then we have guilty, because horrific acronyms for horrific laws is one of the worst habits of Washington, D.C. Read a great article, and we're going to get that to a little bit. Seatnow.org says overseas American voting is like casting pearls before swine, and I kind of agree with that, because you're not getting anything. So let's go over some of the things. Let's talk about how this actually works. Where do rights come from? There's two camps here that argue this. We have inherent inalienable rights belong to the people by operational law, and then there's another camp that says rights come from the federal government. And what United States? Well, the Constitution of the United States of America claims to derive its limited powers from states, all of which derive their power from the people. And now here we go. Two incredibly ignored amendments. These are the two most ignored amendments, I think, at all in the Constitution, proving, by the way, James Madison said, hey, you know why you don't want a Bill of Rights? Because the curse of negative implication. If it's something not expressly stated in the Bill of Rights, people are going to think that right doesn't exist. So we have this. So James Madison put in the Ninth Amendment to hopefully end the curse of the negative implication. The enumeration in the Constitution of certain rights shall not be construed or to deny, disparage other rights retained by other people. That is totally ignored. Ninth Amendment is totally ignored. They only look at the very text of the amendment to see what's there. And then here's a second most ignored amendment, Amendment 10. The powers not delegated to the United States by the Constitution, nor prohibited by it to the states, are reserved to the states respectively. So there's we go. That is the setup for this. And now I'm going to turn it over to Keith. So Keith Redmond is joining me today, along with John Richardson. Keith, now here's the thing. We have this issue where the political parties, and one of them in particular, saying, hey, we need your right to vote. Don't be a single issue voter. We need your vote here. Vote for us. Who cares? You got to do it for democracy, Keith. Is this what's going on here? And what do you say to somebody who says, hey, look, because this is the sort of thing that Democrats abroad are saying, hey, I know the law is totally working against you, but we want your vote anyway. What would you say to somebody like that?
Well, that's been a problem historically, and this is something that, the old adage, what's the definition of insanity? Doing things over and over and expecting the different results, or doing things over and over knowing you're going to get the same result. And so it's a very hard thing for certain Americans overseas, where they're so focused on homeland American issues that they will vote for candidates, and pardon my French, who will screw them. That is what has happened historically. So it's just, for me, mind-boggling that this is occurring. I mean, if there's a candidate out there, this is just my point of view, that is supporting a change for Americans overseas, or at very minimum, acknowledging that there is a terrible situation, then that might be a candidate to vote for. But those are far and few between. I can count on maybe two fingers over all these years, maybe, if there's a candidate like that. But the other problem is that during the voting season right now, it's almost like American overseas issues are not even discussed. And I'll give you an example. The last midterm election, Nancy Pelosi did a message to Americans overseas, which is great to do that. but she did not mention one thing about American overseas issues. Not one.
Not one.
And she wasn't, and the thing is that whether you like her or not, it doesn't matter. Meaning that she probably wasn't even prompted to say anything about it. And that's what is extremely frustrating with the situation with voting. So where does voting get you? And the last point that I'll say is it's this chicken and the egg. I hear, well, if more Americans overseas would vote, then maybe their voices would be heard. Or, and then the other side of it is, well, if there were candidates out there that gave a voice to Americans overseas, maybe the voting would go up. So it's this vicious circle that doesn't seem to end. And it's the same thing every election cycle. Voila.
Right, isn't it? It's the same thing every election cycle. We're going to ask for your vote, and then they'll, oh, well, we'll do it. And they'll get you on some emotional issue that you're sort of associated with. Oh, yeah, let me vote. And then once again, you get, not only do you not get what you want, you get the opposite. They're like, oh, yeah, well, actually, we got to hammer you guys harder.
Now, if I may just interject just one thing.
Yeah.
I'm not talking about American expats who are maybe overseas temporarily for a couple years and going back to the States. Right. I can see them being very interested in just dealing with homeland American issues. I'm talking about Americans overseas who are indefinitely or permanently living outside the United States.
Well, Keith, and this is what I would say about that situation. You know, if you're just there temporarily, well, you're still, because according to the Constitution, as it should be, the reason why you get federal representation is because you live in a state. You live in a state.
Right, exactly.
And
whether
so
you're in the military,
if you're living temporary, right, and if if you're in the military, you're still there at this, you're still connected with that state. So fine, I have no problem with that. If you're still saying, yes, I am still a resident of this state, I am just outside the United States temporarily, and even it could be for a longer time, because you could. I would even say that's someone who's serving this country. They could be overseas, various places for 10, 20 years. They would still associate with that state, and so I wouldn't say that. But it's when you're no longer, you're detached, emotionally. You're not going back to any state. So why are you still, why would you?
Now, keep in mind, this is something that a lot of people don't know about. If you're an American overseas and you have a child, okay, and that child is American, that child is not linked with any state, okay? That child is not
that is messed up.
State. Therefore, there are 13 states, I think maybe 12 right now, where they're not allowed to vote. So you do have Americans overseas who do not have the right to vote. If their parent happens to be linked with any of those 12 or 13 states. You follow me? So there are certain Americans overseas that do not have the right to vote.
Whoa.
At the moment.
Well, wow. That actually sounds like a pretty big story in its own right. Whoa. Yeah. So wait a second. So, last episode we talked about how if you're born a dual citizen, if you're born as an American and some other citizenship, when you look if you look to expatriate from the U.S., you can avoid the exit tax. Clear discrimination based on your lineage. That some people may have a horrific tax bill because of how they're born. Other people, they're all right. But here's the other thing. Now we have a vastly different distinction of rights. If you're a certain type of American born abroad, you can vote. And if you're a different type of American abroad, you can't vote.
It all depends on that American parent and the state that they happen to be linked to that would allow it or not.
I didn't know that. That's utterly insane and clearly violating equal protection. But, I think with a lot of these, this just violates equal protection every way. But hey, look, there's some votes to farm. And that's basically what we have here. Americans abroad are merely a vote farm who get not only nothing in return, but worse than nothing. They get abuse in return. And yet they're still signing up. They're still saying, oh, yeah, let's make sure we vote for this.
And a fundamental problem with that is that Americans overseas, and I'm going to say this twice, Americans overseas who are permanently living overseas do not have representation in Congress. I repeat, they do not have representation in Congress because even if they happen to be linked to a state, everything gets diluted across the 50 states and territories. Unlike, for example, French expats have the right to vote in France, okay? And they vote on issues that are affecting them as French expats. who are living permanently outside of France. And the reason why is that they actually have French representation in the equivalent of the Congress, the National Assembly. They
Oh.
actually have people who actually sit in the National Assembly who will vote on their issues. So that I can
Hmm.
kind of see that's
Yeah,
one.
no,
So,
that would work for
so you
me.
get a lot of
Yeah.
French expats who vote because their issues are either acknowledged or they have a real voice.
Right. You get a voice, whereas,
Well, no, you get more than just a voice because you have, how do you say in English? You have a delegate, you have French expat delegates, if you will,
oh, so there's
around the
many.
world. Yes, there's quite a
Oh,
few. Yeah.
well, I mean, that's actual representation.
Yes.
Oh, so there is an actual way to have actual representations for Americans abroad. The United States
Sure.
of America just, it
Just
seems like
doesn't
it
do it.
intentionally chooses not to give them that. Just today, we just want your vote, just so you can, hey, look, here's a tight election here. We need some absent, we need some votes from abroad to get the election to go our way. And thanks for those votes. Bye. Now here's a FATCA for you. That's what we have now. Move the conversation over to John Richardson. Let's see here. He's been awfully quiet there. He's just been listening. John, by the way, I got to tell you something. You have a huge fan base. You know that?
Yes,
You
he
do.
does.
Yeah, no, you really do. A friend of mine, one of my good friends, has been listening, watching this podcast. He's, I love John. He is fantastic. You have a huge. This is my oldest friend. He's not even a tax guy. You say, hey, I just started watching your channel. I go, man, John is great. You have a really huge fan, and I'm a huge fan, as you know. You
I
continue.
mean, you're like the Taylor Swift of taxation.
Yeah. I don't know. Well, no, he's not satanic. Anyway, all right, let's go over to John Richardson. John, you have been listening to us, and Keith and I go on, and so I'm sure you have something to say here. So, is this true? By the way, let me get the screen share up here. Is this true that the right for the right for expats to vote erupted in January 2nd, 1976? Is that true?
That is correct.
Wow.
So I think what should be added to the discussion so far, and it's interesting to me that people are not aware of this, is that no American citizen has a constitutional right to vote. Okay, period. I'll say it again. American citizens do not, because of their citizenship, have a constitutional right to vote. There is no constitutional right to vote. Okay. Now, there are constitutional provisions that, assuming a right to vote in a state, would prevent the states from discriminating in certain ways. But it's very interesting that there is no constitutional right to vote at all. And what I find,
well, John, I would just interrupt there to say I agree with you. There is no federal constitutional right to vote. That's absolutely true. But every state has a constitutionalized right to vote. Your right to vote is defined by your state, the state in which you live in.
that is right. That is right. But they limit who can vote. Okay.
Correct.
Now,
Correct.
Let's look at, for example, when I was putting this together, I looked at Massachusetts. And I looked at the Constitution of Massachusetts as an example. And, it lays out who has the right to vote, and it's decided, basically by the government. Okay. So it's not like, every resident of Massachusetts or whatever. I mean, there are restrictions. For example, people who are incarcerated. And I think that's very odd, right? I mean, imagine depriving a group of people from the right to vote who are being incarcerated according to laws, put together by the majority, right? I mean, it's quite interesting. It's sort of a weaponization of the right to vote. But main point is this, okay, that unlike constitutions in some other countries, Canada constitutionalized the right to vote only in 1982, by the way. Okay. There is no constitutional right to vote, and I think that's actually quite significant. So what happened was, and there's a very interesting there's a book about this. I think it's called The Unknown Ambassadors. But if one were to go to the AARO.org website, there's some discussion of this, and Arrow is claiming some credit and had some role in bringing this to be. But I'm going to say something here that I'm sure is going to be contentious, and I think probably, frankly, offensive to a lot of people. But I don't think Americans abroad should have any right to vote.
I agree.
At all.
I agree. Well, except those who are temporarily overseas.
Well,
as
you
I
know,
said
5
earlier.
years, something like this, right? But the reason is this: if we look at what happened in 1976, you know, we've had a lot of discussion over the years about how, you know, the whole meaning of taxation and citizenship has evolved over the years. In 1976, or the years leading up to this, probably say 73 to 76, the concept of an American abroad, I think, was overwhelmingly Americans who really did have a connection to the United States. Remember that 73 is only 6 years after the Euphorium decision that essentially legalized dual citizenship, although it wasn't understood at that time. And what happened in the years, you know, really starting, you know, in the early 70s was that, you know, anybody became an American citizen basically because there was no provision left for them to lose citizenship. So what we have now is a situation where many American citizens have the right to vote, although not all. But the question now becomes, what is an American citizen? Okay, and the legal definition of citizen includes a large and incredibly, probably a majority of these American citizens have no connection to the United States whatsoever, right? So now we have, and I don't want to start a food fight with Democrats abroad, but I think it's inevitable, you know, that they're walking around, you know, scouring the world for anybody who's a U.S. citizen. I mean, it's almost check, see if you might be a U.S. citizen, right? In other words, what's happening now is that there's a tendency to seek anybody who is technically a U.S. citizen, who has no connection whatsoever to the country, and saying, look, you have the right to vote. We're going to bus you in. It's like a big political convention. We're going to bus you in to vote. Now, let's look at this. Now, I think that's ridiculous, okay? And if we put it that way, I think a lot of other people would. But let's look at this from the point of view of, you know, after the last presidential election, DA was saying, oh, overseas Americans made the difference. They carried the states of Arizona.
Right. They're bragging about it, right? They're bragging about it. Yeah.
Let's pause for a minute, Anthony, and let's say you live in Arizona or Georgia. Do you think it's fair? Okay, now bear in mind the way this works is that you get to vote in the state you were last domiciled in, or yet, if you're the child of somebody in one of these states who can vote, the state your parents were last domiciled in, you have no connection to the state.
None.
Yet,
nope.
Somehow or other, you have the right to impact what goes on in that state.
Right, and your only knowledge of what happens from the state is what you have no direct knowledge of what's happening in the state. You're only, oh, that's what I saw on the screen. Oh, okay, that's what I saw. Oh, that must be okay. Vote for it. So it's just this arrogance. It's a vanity. That's what I look at. It's like it's a vanity. You want to vote on something you don't even know about. You don't know about. But well, my decision's important. But why? Why? I mean, that's
part of the issue here. It's whether they know about what's going on in Arizona or not. They don't live there. Okay. And, you know, Tip O'Neill, the late Tip O'Neill, famous Massachusetts congressman, had a book out where he said all politics is local. And I think that there's a good deal of truth to that. All right. So what we have now is a system where people, because they're technically American citizens, I mean, they would have lost citizenship under, you know, in a previous time, and particularly they would have lost citizenship during the time in 76 when this law was passed, okay, are now able to vote and influence the results in elections of places they have absolutely no connection to whatsoever. And I think that that is wrong. I think that is wrong. And I think that, you know, the people who actually live in the United States, in these states, Arizona or Georgia, I think would be extremely offended by the idea that somebody who doesn't even live there is influencing what goes on in that state.
I have a question.
Go ahead, Keith. Go ahead, Keith.
John, I have a hypothetical here. I hear what you're saying. Let's say Americans overseas actually had representation in Congress, like French expats do.
That would be
They
a
actually,
completely different situation.
okay, okay.
Right, because you're not voting. You're actually voting on something relevant to you.
Right.
That would be that would be, here's really, I'm looking at the actual law right here.
Yes.
I want to zero in, and it's right here at the law. It says any election in district of such state in which he was last domiciled. Immediately, domicile is a word. Okay, that
Yeah.
means something specifically. Means where you intend to live. So you're saying you no longer intend to live there, but you're going to vote there. I mean, it says it right there. You're no longer domiciled there, but you should vote there. That's utterly insane.
Yeah,
That is diluting the vote of the people there. You're taking away the voting rights of people.
Yeah,
That's a way to get rid of voting rights. Go ahead, John.
Yeah, listen, first of all, I didn't want to overdo this thing. This is the seminal legislation. In 1986, there were some changes, additions, cleanups, etc. Most people talk about the 86 law, but nothing has changed in any way that I think is material to what's going on here. Now, to Keith's point, okay, I think that if overseas Americans had representatives the way they do in France, and by the way, territories, have representatives, in Congress, etc., then I think that would be an entirely different thing, because then you'd have people voting for, a group of, for representatives that actually reflected their interests and not something else. But I think there's something incredibly offensive about, I really feel unusually strongly about this. Okay. I think there's something incredibly offensive about, overseas Americans being able to influence the elections in states like Arizona and Georgia, and they may have never even lived there, or they may have never.
Yeah.
And then you get DA bragging about this. Now,
Right.
On the question of this, going out and farming votes or something. Now, look, I'm not casting any negative aspersions on any individuals. I think that, I think there's room for reasonable disagreement, okay, on this particular issue. But I disagree profoundly, right? So I live in Toronto, Canada, as you know, and it is so crazy here that the last election, on the street parallel to where I live, there's signs up. The Democrats have got signs up, to get people to vote, right? And these are targeted at anybody who, it's sort of like, here, let's check and see if you might have a right to vote in a U.S. election, right? I mean, what they're doing is they're reaching out to people who feel no connection to the United States whatsoever, and it's worse. It's worse because many of these people are dual citizens. All right. Now, I don't think that that's determinative, but I think that's
I do.
I think that's
I do.
a factor. When you
I am
have not only non-resident voting, but they're dual citizens, and their primary citizenship probably is not American citizenship anyway.
Right.
At least in many cases.
Right. Yeah. Exactly. People who,
they drive these cars, by the way, that these little things with, deep decals on them saying vote this, vote that. And what they are doing is trying to round up votes, right, among a group of people who probably are dual citizens. I mean, if they really felt strongly about it, they wouldn't need to be rounded up to vote. They are manufacturing a voting base to influence American elections from abroad. Now, if you put it that way, I mean, what if one were to say, well, why don't we go over to Russia or China, and let's get a bunch of people in Russia or China, to influence American elections. I mean, I agree there are technical differences, but I don't think substantively it's that far off.
All right. I'm going to throw a question out. This is actually for everybody. I want to get some responses on this question, and whether you live overseas or actually in the United States. Would you give up your right to vote in federal elections in order to be exempt from federal taxation? I live in Connecticut. Oh, I definitely would, because I understand I would. There's no representation for my interests in Washington, D.C., and I don't even live overseas. And I think if you're overseas, and so if people want to comment whether or not they would give up their,
I would give up my right to vote living overseas and not having to deal with the U.S. tax system. I definitely would.
I think that's fair.
And then if I'm moving to the United States, then I can vote in the United States because that's where I'm living.
Right.
That's fine.
Right.
That's fine. I know a lot of people will vehemently disagree with me on this, but then again, they're not the ones that deal with the people whose lives are being ruined every day.
Right. Yeah, those are the people with their heads in the sand pretending everything's honky-dory and saying, oh, well, there's the foreign income exclusion. What are you talking about? And by the way, last week we did go over sort of the differences between expats and why you will get varying disagreement about how difficult the U.S. tax code is. And really what we discovered, what our conclusion was, if your financial center of gravity still in the United States, living overseas might not be a bad thing. And you could be looking at us like, what's their problem? It's not that big of a deal. It's when your financial center of gravity moves outside the US. That's when horrific things happen with the tax code that are utterly unbelievable in their depravity. They truly.
Yeah.
And that's really, and that's unfortunately the problem that we have, because as Democrats abroad are going for votes around the world, a lot of people, it's not really a big deal. Oh yeah, sure. What's the problem? Oh, they're just complaining about this for reasons I don't know. They just must be making it up, right? Now we do have this. I was reading this article this morning. I didn't read it before, but go ahead, Keith.
I just want to say something, and I'll do my best to say it. We're speaking about Democrats abroad, and this has nothing to do with being a Democrat or a Republican or anything in between.
Nothing.
The reason why we're bringing up Democrats abroad is because they have a very strong structure in getting out the vote.
Yes.
And it's the activities that they're doing. And we would have the same discussion if Republicans overseas were doing the same thing. Same exact discussion. So I just want to make it clear for everyone who's listening, we're not saying that Democrats are bad on this call. What we're saying is that what they're doing, their comportment, is just not acceptable. Does that make sense?
Absolutely, Keith. Thank you for that. I agree with you entirely on that, because this and for those. I don't have a thing against Democrats. I don't have an axe to grind.
I'm more aligned to being a Democrat than I am with a Republican. But that's my personal thing.
I would say this
with the mechanism.
I would say this. I'm not about to elevate them. I would treat them equally. Except this is what I would say. This past election, there was a local election, and I opened up my office to the Democratic candidate for mayor in my town. And so I'm a Republican, have been, but I was like, I really like this guy on the issues. I think he knows it better. I want to support him. And so I was actually able to sit in on watching a Democrat campaign. And this is what I learned. The Democrat get out the vote effort is they actually have an effort. Republicans don't. They don't. No. They don't do any of. I mean, the phone calls, the knocking on doors. Hey, here's this. There's this. Democrats don't. Or the Republicans don't do it. So I am. This is only. We're only, I guess, picking on the Democrats because they're doing what the Republicans should do, but the Republicans just don't do it. For reasons why I'm not entirely sure. So that's really why the Democrats abroad are I think are getting the bulk of it, but it's not anything that I am not
to do with their ideology. It has
but I'm not claiming that voting for Republicans would get you much more, because let us not forget the 2017 Tax Cuts and Jobs Act brought us the transition tax.
And there were Republicans in Congress, and some have passed, who had no desire to help expats. And they have said that. So it's on both sides of the aisle, if you will. That's why this whole thing is so absurd to continue voting for people who will continue to screw them.
Yeah. Well, here's a great here's a great comment here. And I think this is sort of because here's the problem that we have is that I'm stating things in the abstract. I'm stating things theoretical. So, so it's a great question. Hey, look, we have no representation overseas. So should you? Because the law should be changed, but the law probably won't be changed. So what should you do? And so what do you think? Would you still great, someone could say, yeah, great job, Anthony. Really appreciate you telling me that, I shouldn't vote overseas. I see why. So should I not vote overseas? Great. Until there's a change, should I continue to vote? Which I guess is up to
that's
some.
a
I mean,
good
I
point.
don't know how to answer. Right, I don't know how to answer
Yeah.
that. It's like, well, it's up to you.
Right.
That's up to you.
Listen, you know, we're all. I think I'd like to focus. I think on what we really are should be talking about. Okay.
Yeah.
This is about the democratic process generally. Okay, this has nothing to do with Republicans or Democrats. It has to do,
Small d. Small d.
it has to do with the democratic process
Yeah.
as a general principle. And I think the question is this. Question is, should people be allowed to vote in elections where they don't live? Okay, that's I think the
Exactly.
question here. Okay, and if we put it together that way, I think I think there may be disagreement on the answer to that, but at least it's clear what you're talking about. Okay,
that's a much better way to frame the issue.
number
Absolutely,
two.
yeah.
Number two. I was kind of waiting, for some comment to come on about, linking taxation and voting. And I think that there should not be any connection between taxation and voting whatsoever. I mean, this was one of the problems historically in the democratic process. I mean, if you look at the history of this, and, I think I linked to something or other that I showed you, for a long time, I mean, voting was restricted to property owners or taxpayers, or this, that, and the other thing. And, gradually, and I agree with this, I think that, a fundamental pillar of democracy is that people should have the right to vote in the places they live, whether they own property or not, et cetera. And I think that any discussion of taxation in relation to voting, confuses the issue and perpetuates that as an issue. I mean, let's not kid ourselves. As what Romney pointed out, 50% of Americans don't pay federal taxes anyway. Does that mean they should be excluded from voting? I don't know. Now, I do think that if Americans abroad were banned from voting, I think that it would make it easier to argue to get rid of citizenship taxation because it removes that reflexive, oh, you have the right to vote. Now, on the issue of the right to vote, this reminds me, sometime when I was in law school, I remember talking to some guy who's, this
Some
time
guy.
Cold War, Russia, etc. And I didn't realize that people in Russia could vote, and the guy said to me, no, John, I mean, you're completely wrong. Of course, people in Russia can vote. It's just that, there's nobody for them to vote for particularly, et cetera. And that accurately describes the issue of Americans abroad as well. They have nobody to vote for. So this whole issue of the vote is what I would say it's a necessary but not a sufficient condition for democracy. Obviously, the United States at the present time, although this isn't the topic of our conversation today, could not, under any definition, be considered to be a functioning democracy. All right. It's completely run by the political parties. The proof of that is we're going to get the same two candidates, Trump and Biden, which is the fact that there's no renewal is an embarrassment to the democratic process, not necessarily who they are. But, the point is that the vote itself has very, very little to do with the integrity of the democratic process anyway. The problem we have, and this is, by the way, true, it includes Americans abroad, but it's also true for resident Americans. They have nobody who represents them either. All right.
Well, that's my point. We're who are we voting? It's because the federal government has defined, and that's the problem with the federal government defining who can vote. And that's the problem with the federal government creating new voting rights, because rights are supposed to come from the people who are in states, and those states then go to Congress. Now, the 17th Amendment got rid of that whole check because those senators were appointed by states. They got rid of that, so we had a popular election of senators. Because think about it, how would you? I mean, that's the true structure of the Constitution. The states are supposed to appoint the senators so that the Senate is really protecting the states, so that the federal government doesn't pass these wild mandates on states that they have an obligation on. Because that's what's happened, because the federal government passes these things. Okay, now the states have to do the bidding of the federal government. So it's the other way around. Supposed to be the other way around, but that is what happened. And the 17th Amendment is just one erosion. And I would just say this, we have a republic, not a democracy. We have democratically elected officials, but we are a republic. And I think I've actually I've had some discussions with friends about, is this even possible? Is it even possible? Because the United States was founded as a republic because of the precise problems you have with democracy. Democracy means mob rule, flat out mob rule. Whatever the mob wants to do, 100% allowed. It's constitutional. A republic says, hey, look, the majority can only do so much, but once they hit on a fundamental right of one individual, okay, there's a fundamental right established. We have to take a close look at what's going on. That's what's supposed to happen, and it hasn't happened. It hasn't happened. It hasn't happened since the inception of this country. The very first, we talked about this before, the very first tax passed to this country was intentionally punitive, was intentionally designed to expropriate money from a particular party or a person that is somebody who lived in the rural areas of the state, because the excise tax hit them the hardest, because the whiskey that they made was essentially their top food source and the backbone of their economy. So from the beginning, the very first law passed in this country, it should have been ruled unconstitutional, but it wasn't. Magically, it wasn't. So we're kind of stuck in this situation where, you know what, we've tried the republic thing. We really have tried the republic thing. And I'm not really seeing it's working. I am not seeing how this republic thing is working at all. And I'm kind of more of the opinion, like, what's good? It's the best form of government we've ever had in history. Not that it lasts a long time, is when you're ruled by a good king. Like, that's the best thing to have. If you are ruled by a good king, that's the best thing to have. It just doesn't happen a lot. That's the problem. It doesn't, and then they die. So that's kind of the problem. So I think we're far away. And I think what we need to do is open our eyes to the fact that what we ask for, it's despite the pretty language of the founding of this Constitution and how great it is that we all got together, and man, it was a magical time when those founders oh man, I couldn't believe it. It was such a great time that they did it, and they put their selfish interests aside and did the better good. And now from then on, this country's been great. Or maybe that was just a lie. Maybe that was just a lie passed by the victors to say, hey, we got the power we want. Maybe the Articles of Confederation were fine the way they are, but the one thing they didn't have was massive federal power that could be abused and monetized by people on the inside. So that's where I'm at. I'm at the point where I'm not even sure what voting does at all, period, because I don't see any evidence. I don't see any evidence that we actually get anything we want.
Anthony, should Americans abroad have the right to vote in these elections? What do you think? Yes or no?
No.
Keith?
Say that question one more time, please.
Should Americans abroad have the right, as is presently constituted, to vote in these U.S. elections?
I have to qualify it. If you're an American permanently living outside the United States, then the answer is no. The only if you are a short-term American and you're going back to the U.S., I say yes.
Let me follow up with this question then. Let me follow up with this question. So, I come back to Canada because it's where I live, and I have sort of a peripheral awareness of what's going on. But the government of Canada passed a law saying that Canadian expats who'd been outside the country for more than 5 years lost their right to vote in federal elections. In other words, what they were trying to do, obviously, was, focus on the connection between, being there, et cetera. The Canadian Constitution gives citizens a constitutional right to vote. The case went to the Supreme Court of Canada. This was about 5 years ago. It's a case named Fring. And interestingly, the Supreme Court of Canada upheld the right of Canadian expats, just based on citizenship, regardless of how long they've been out of the country, to vote in federal elections. Now, I wonder if that isn't because there is in fact, I think it was, is what I'm saying. Okay, it's because the Canadian Constitution has a constitutional right to vote. Now, the U.S. Constitution has no constitutional right to vote whatsoever. There's no problem at all. Just simply, I think, changing this law to, require, to not give Americans abroad or overseas Americans, a fundamental right to vote. I mean, I think that this is, I think this is subject to abuse. I think it's very unfair to the people in these states who have to deal with the results of these elections. You know.
Well, I mean, well, this is, John, what you were saying before kind of got me thinking a little bit, because you said, hey, you're talking about your friend in Soviet Union. Oh, I assume he's your friend. I was just thinking about, I was like, what do the Soviet Union, Cuba, Venezuela, North Korea have in common? Those are all places where there's the right to vote.
Huh?
China, there's a right to vote in all those countries.
Is there a right to vote, or does everybody just? I don't know. Anyway, there is voting. There is voting.
Well, that's what
happens with the vote.
Well, that's my point, guys. Is that it's very easy. It's very easy to say, "Oh yeah, we have elections. Oh, yeah, it's on the now elections that actually matter, that reflect the will of the people." Well,
that's a whole different story.
I don't know when that's right. It happens every now and then, but that's the point. And so that that the right to vote is used as a weapon to distract us from actually what's going on, because oftentimes during the primary process, the person people want is actually knocked off the ballot through dirty tricks. That happens a lot in primaries.
Or you have African Americans for many years had the right to vote, quote unquote, but so many things were put into place, like counting jelly beans in a jar, to disqualify them from voting. But they did have the right to vote. You see what I mean?
Right, exactly. So claiming, and I think so this right to vote, this claim is like the top. It seems like if you are a tyrant, the first thing you want to do is make sure that you give your people the right to vote. That way you can say, "Hey, I was elected," and then whatever happens in election and that puts you back in power. Hey, it's just a democratic process. What are you going to do? So that's where it's like I'm sort of taking a jaundiced view on all voting, because the process behind the elections makes your vote weak already. You're not voting for who you wanted to in the first place. So you're not at all. You're not voting for who you really want. You're voting for what was delivered to you.
You're not. And worse than that, Anthony. I mean, the way the party system works, the nominating process, particularly with the Democrats, with the these super delegates.
Yeah.
Jesus Christ! I mean,
right.
I don't understand how any individual American citizen is able to make any contribution to the democratic process other than when somebody comes around and says, "Here, I'd like you to vote." I mean, it's terrible. I mean, and we could go on and on about this. I mean, I think it's partly because it's a two-party system instead of multiple parties.
Well, and I think that's by design, though. And I think that's.
Okay, but let's get back to the issue of Americans abroad here. So
yeah, keep it on that.
What if America had a law like Canada had that was struck down that said, well, American expats have the right to vote for the first 5 years they haven't lived in the country, then no longer a right to vote? What would you think about that?
If
you leave the United States, you move from the United States, you have the right to vote for the first 5 years you're gone, and then after that you lose the right to vote.
Well, see, I would still go with Keith's qualification, because if somebody was in the military service and they're gone for more than 5 years, I would still say
military is excluded.
Okay, then I agree with you.
Or they're a short-term expat. They're only overseas for a couple of years, and it happens to fall during an election year. They should have the right to vote in U.S. elections.
Yeah, but doesn't that cover it? Say with a 5-year rule. I mean, I'm not promoting
right.
But I mean, the 5-year rule is a recent rule in a country that is at least considered to be a functioning democracy.
All right. This is a great comment here from Melvin. Melvin,
I saw that. Yeah.
Yeah, Mel. The discussion is pretty theoretical. Democracy is not perfect, but the alternatives are even worse. Which alternative are you speaking about, Melvin? Which alternative are you speaking about? Because let's see, Soviet Union was democratic, Cuba was democratic, Venezuela was democratic. They're all democratic.
Okay. Hey. Well,
so which one is worse?
We're not talking about democracy. We're talking about a very specific aspect of it, which is, should people who don't live in a place have the right to vote? In an election
in that place. Yeah.
That's what we're talking about. I mean, so this is a Winston Churchill. Democracy is the worst form of government, except for the other options or something.
No, I disagree with him.
Well, I don't know. Maybe whatever. But I mean, again,
he did a lot of horrible things.
I mean, at all.
Well, that's a whole other subject.
Yeah. All right. Yeah.
What are we talking about here?
Yeah.
And that is,
Well-
and this matters because the question, it seems to me, is, is it reasonable for Democrats abroad Canada, which they're clearly doing, to go around and essentially uncover possible voters? Oh my God, you might be an American, right? And then say, well, come on, vote then. This is, I think, incredibly abusive, incredibly abusive.
Yeah, and I just want to cover this comment here. We have a silent M, I see. I don't, McNello just tuned in. He read somewhere that expats, and you know what? And I didn't know this. I didn't even, I didn't know this.
I mean, but that's true. But and no disrespect to the person who wrote it, but that's not really the essence of this podcast, because it goes back to what John said. Should an American overseas, regardless of his or her ideology or political leanings, have the right to vote in a place they don't live?
Right. I guess I'm looking at this comment more. It's interesting. I think it's more interesting that the person who's going to be overseas will tend to be more left leaning. I didn't know that. I thought it was pretty much split, and it's only through doing this for years. Like, oh wow.
But
so
when you get over into Asia, that's a little bit different. Some of them are a little bit more right leaning. So, but again, it goes down to ideology, and that's just something that we don't want to get into.
Yeah, no, we're not. Yeah, we're not really talking about that. Except,
Well,
we're not.
Part of the comment that needs to be focused on is the logistics, right?
Yeah.
Which I interpret to mean, difficulties. And this is I think, it's an interesting issue. It's not that easy for Americans to vote.
Yeah, well, Keith, could you run us through the process for voting overseas right now?
Yeah. To my knowledge, and just from my experience over these many years, is there's a couple mechanisms in which an American overseas can vote. So one mechanism is in the state that they're linked to, they can request an absentee ballot. All right. And that absentee ballot is perceived that you happen to be outside the United States for whatever reason during that particular election period. So you get an absentee ballot, which is the same type of ballot that you would get if you were living in that state. However, with that absentee ballot, you have to be very careful and only vote for president, senators, your representative, maybe governor, but probably not. And that's it. Nothing else as far as local referendums or local representation. Because if you do vote for local representatives local representation and local referendums in some states, because this happened to me, in some states that could be construed as that you could be looked at as a tax resident of that state, and they can come after you. That's what happened to me on that, and I got out of it. Now, the other mechanism is you can go through Democrats Abroad, Vote From Abroad program, or the Federal Voter Assistance Program, and vote where you get a ballot and you just vote in the federal election, and that's it. So you have those two mechanisms in which you can vote. Does that sound clear?
That's now, I guess. So my only question is on when you're requesting that absentee ballot.
Yes.
You said you have to be careful not to vote for everybody on the ballot.
Well, if you're an American overseas permanently, and you get that absentee ballot that you just happen to be out of that state that you're linked to for that particular period of election, you need to be careful to not vote in the local representation or local referendums. You just keep it top line, because some states are very sticklers when it comes to that, where they can be perceived that you are not severing your link with that state, so they can feasibly come after you for state taxes. And again, that happened to me a few years ago. Okay.
Wow. Yeah,
and I was able to get out of that. But this is what I was told by the
about the 1986 law.
What?
There's a provision. There's actually a specific provision. There's a specific section that says that the fact that somebody votes cannot be used as evidence of domicile for other.
Well, that's true, but not everybody knows that, John, because as you know, you helped me deal with that.
I'm just saying it's in there. And no, I would not trust these governments. Okay.
No. And I actually spoke to the comptroller in the state of Maryland in regards to this. And this at the time is what he said to me. And he gave examples of some other states. So if you're a temporary American expat and you're going back to that state, no problem, vote for everything. But if you're an American immigrant outside the United States, I would go through, as it stands right now, through the federal voting assistance program or the vote from abroad platform, and that's it. You got to be
yeah. And just a comment from Melvin here. Yeah, Melvin, exactly. And this is what I would say too. You might screw yourself tax wise. Yeah, absolutely. And be careful of that state. Keith was, I could say this, Keith was not in California. California.
No, I was in Maryland,
Yeah.
and they were looking for back taxes. And
Yeah.
I even sent in proof that I was living in Paris.
Yeah,
And
but when
it took a lot of back and forth and
a
lawsuit.
And two states that might not be so kind, with California, they're incredibly
And New
aggressive.
York.
In New York, there you go. Yeah, New York is insane. So especially those two right there.
Right. There are some others, but
oh man, those are California and New York. And
Maryland
New York,
is
New York. Yeah, Maryland isn't. Yeah, New York has got to be, I think, probably the most aggressive all around, and California is just so big and big, and I mean those rates just keep going up and up and up. So yeah, absolutely, you want to watch that. So what you're doing,
just vote in federal elections and keep it simple. That's it.
There you go. Or
don't vote down ballot.
Or just realize you're given a false choice and don't participate is the other option. I suppose you have too. So anything else to add? Any comments? Anyone want to comment a little more? Yeah, go ahead, John Richardson.
Actually, here's something that I think is important, particularly when there's a lot of, were you born in the United States, therefore you can vote. One of the issues since, really 2010 has been on whether people are still U.S. citizens from an immigration point of view if they, during certain periods, committed expatriating acts like becoming a citizen of another country. And there are people who have and continue to get backdated certificates of loss of nationality based on the expatriating act as it was at the time of becoming a citizen of, say, Canada or something like that. I just want to make the narrow but important point, and I have had this experience with people, that if they go vote, they no longer have any claim that they lost U.S. citizenship in earlier years. And I have had at least 2 or 3 people over the years who deeply regretted voting because it meant that they had behaved as an American citizen, completely cut off any argument that they lost U.S. citizenship, years earlier, et cetera. And Keith and I actually did a podcast about this, I don't know if Keith remembers, probably in 2020. But that's the thing about the voting. I would be very, very wary of people knocking on your door and saying, "Hi, I'm from a certain political." I was just wondering, were you born in the United States by chance? Do you know anybody who was born in the United States? They might have the right to vote and help us out here. Why don't we see if you might possibly be a U.S. citizen? What do you say? This shows the absurdity of this, and this is why I think the only solution is either prohibit Americans abroad from voting or put some kind of a 5-year, 10-year, whatever you want to do, time limit on this. Because otherwise, you've got the situation where you have people who are likely dual citizens.
Dual citizens with no connection with in their vote area.
Influencing the results in places they don't even live. And it is beyond me. Maybe you can help me understand why people don't see it from this point of view. Help me. Why don't they?
Yeah. Right on. All right. Well,
go to Arizona. Why don't we do a podcast from Arizona? And we're gonna poll people. We'll pull them over on the street and say, "Hey, did you know that somebody who lives in Venezuela is going to affect the result of your election in Arizona?" I just want to know how you feel about that.
How do you feel about that? Right on. How do you? And then they're going to brag about it too. They're going to brag about it.
Oh yeah, this is absolutely unbelievable. Yes, we who do not live in the United States impacted this election in the United States.
Yeah, indeed. All right. Well, let's. I want to. All right, we're about out of time, and I just want to get to our call to action here. If you are thinking about expatriating and renouncing your citizenship, John Richardson is a great great person to reach out to. Let me just get his email up here. I have it buried somewhere here. And where is it? Here we go. Citizenship Solutions at protonmail.com. John handles a lot of the trickiest expatriations around, and his depth of knowledge. I hope you guys can. I think he's demonstrated it week after week after week, and he continues to educate me at the highest possible level. And he doesn't even charge me any money. What a nice guy! What a nice guy. And if you are, and this is something that we've talked about before, if you are thinking about disclosing or something, you have a tax issue going on, the place where you may not want to start is with an attorney like myself or John Richardson, but really with Keith Redmond. As an attorney, I have to basically always advise compliance. What you tell me is confidential, but you're going to hear something and say, yes, I think you should comply. Might be a great idea to reach out to Keith Redmond at US_overseas_advocate@outlook.com, as he advises many people on whether they should enter the system, disclose, not disclose. He can give you a feedback of what people around the world are actually doing and what's actually working. He's a fantastic resource. And if you are thinking about, if you do need help with an offshore disclosure or something like that, I just have this page up right now. We just got it up. Go to irismedic.com/offshore. By the way, if you're looking for tax prep for this year, you just change out offshore to prep, and you'll go to that prep page too as well. We'd love to be helping you out. Do we know what we're going to talk about next week? We're going to be talking about that. I mean, you got to. By the way, you got to, because we have a lot of stuff we got to get to too. Because I think we had a lot of debate on what we're doing today. So you want to make sure you subscribe and turn on notifications so you know when we're going live. Because actually today we had to go a little live. Normally we're on Tuesdays, but we had to go to a little live. Those who subscribe and turn on notifications were able to join us. So be sure you do that. And I'm sure next week we are going to handle something fantastic. Any ideas? Any ideas we could tease?
Well, you're tuning in to Prague, right, on Sunday, right? I'll be in Prague.
Oh, that's right. That's what's going on. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you for reminding. Right. Sunday, we're going to be doing a special one from Prague. We are going to be tuning in. John will be there live, and we are going at, and that's what time is that local time?
7 a.m. Eastern.
7 a.m. Eastern time, 1300 local time.
Right.
Yeah. So we have that already up. That is already up. So get up and share that. You won't want to miss that. Yeah, go ahead, John.
I just had a thought I want to float, okay, before we go. I got this thought because you were talking about an offshore disclosure. Do you realize that, if the accounts of Americans are offshore, do you realize that the votes of Americans abroad are also offshore?
Yeah.
Yeah.
These are offshore votes. Votes from offshore.
I always thought offshore's bad things too. Well, you're offshore, right?
They're offshore votes.
Right? Aren't we supposed to treat everything offshore with suspicion? But
well, that's right. Except somehow, if they get manufactured here. I mean, I think that we ought to create, as an alternative to the vote from abroad, why don't we create a site, the offshore vote?
Offshore vote. Here we go. Maybe then Congress won't like it so much, right? Maybe then.
It's absolutely true, isn't it?
Right. It's offshore voting. Offshore voting is probably the way to say. Let's maybe make that a point. Do you agree with offshore voting?
Yeah. No. I mean, you put it that way, it's entirely different. But the main point is this. I mean, it's like citizenship taxation. Over the years, the meaning of citizenship, the meaning of Americans abroad has changed so much that I have very serious doubts that if this issue were raised today as a new issue, and Congress were to look at who these overseas Americans really are and their dual citizenship and everything, I doubt very much that they'd get the right to vote. I doubt it very much.
Yeah, I think you're right. All right. Well, thank you very much, gentlemen, and we'll see you all on this Sunday. What is it? The 21st?
21st.
The 21st. All right. See you soon, guys. Thanks a lot.